My name is Rebecca, and I am 33 years old, the daughter they overlooked, the sister they favored, the one who spent decades invisible while my family thrived on my silence. For years, I carried their expectations, swallowed my pain, and pretended that being strong meant never being seen. But I've learned a dangerous truth. You can be patient, you can be quiet, you can endure and still rise in a way they will never forget. This is the story of how I reclaimed my life, my voice, and my worth, quietly, deliberately, and unapologetically. I learned very early that love in my family did not arrive on its own. It came with conditions, and I learned even earlier that I was not meant to ask for it. Some children cry loudly and are picked up, others cry quietly and are told to be brave. I was the second kind. My earliest memory is not of happiness or toys or laughter. It is of waiting for someone to notice that I was trying too hard. Waiting for someone to say, "You don't have to be strong today." No one ever did. I grew up in a house where noise meant importance. Whoever spoke the loudest, whoever needed the most, whoever broke down first, they received attention. I watched from the corners of rooms, holding myself together because I could feel it even as a child. If I fell apart, there would be no hands to catch me, so I learned not to fall. I was praised for being mature, for being understanding, for not causing problems. They said it like it was a gift. I didn't know then that those words were shaping a cage around me. When I was 7, I came home from school with a scraped knee and a torn uniform. It wasn't a big injury, just blood, dirt, and pain that felt heavier because I had tried not to cry in front of my classmates. I walked into the house slowly, hoping someone would look up. My mother was busy, my father was tired, my sibling was already upset about something else. I stood there, knee burning, waiting. Finally, my mother glanced at me and said, "What happened?" I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, my sibling started crying louder from the other room. My mother turned away immediately. "Rebecca, go wash it, you're fine." That was it, no hug, no concern, no follow-up. I remember standing alone in the bathroom, water running over my skin, watching the blood swirl down the drain and thinking, so this is how it works. Pain only matters if it interrupts someone else's life. That day, something small but permanent settled inside me. I stopped expecting comfort. As I grew older, the pattern became clearer. If something broke, I fixed it. If someone was angry, I stayed calm. If there was tension, I absorbed it. I became the emotional storage room of the house. Everything unwanted was placed inside me quietly. When my parents argued, they would later say, "At least Rebecca understands." When my sibling made mistakes, they would sigh and say, "Be patient, you're older." Older didn't mean wiser. It meant less protected. I was never asked how I felt. I was asked how much I could handle, and I always answered by surviving. I don't remember being asked what I wanted to be when I grew up. I remember being told what was practical, what was safe, what wouldn't cause trouble. Dreams felt selfish in a house where peace was fragile. So I learned to shrink my wants until they fit into everyone else's comfort. I smiled when I was praised for being low maintenance. I didn't know that love isn't supposed to feel like maintenance at all. By the time I was a teenager, I had perfected invisibility. Teachers loved me, relatives admired me. Everyone said, "Rebecca is so easy. Easy to ignore, easy to lean on, easy to overlook." When I struggled in silence, it went unnoticed because I never asked for help the right way, the loud way, the desperate way. I thought if I endured long enough, someone would eventually see me. I didn't realize that endurance was exactly why they didn't. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, when I first felt anger toward my family. I was 16. I had worked for weeks on something that mattered to me. I won't say what it was because the details don't matter as much as the feeling. I was proud, nervous, hopeful. I handed it to my parents with shaking hands. My father glanced at it briefly. My mother smiled politely. "That's nice, Rebecca," she said. Then she turned to my sibling and asked about their day. The conversation moved on like I hadn't just offered a piece of myself. I sat there, heart pounding, waiting for someone to come back to me. No one did. Something cracked that day, not loudly. Not dramatically, just enough for me to realize they were not going to meet me halfway. I stopped sharing after that. I stopped bringing my heart into rooms where it would be left unattended. From the outside, I looked fine, responsible, put together. Inside, I was learning a dangerous lesson. My needs are an inconvenience. At 33, people call me strong. They say it like it's the best thing about me. They don't see the cost. They don't see the little girl who learned to swallow pain because there was no space for it. They don't see how hard it is for me to ask for anything, even now. They don't know that every time someone says, "You'll be okay," a part of me hears, "You're on your own." The truth is, I never asked my family to choose me over anyone else. I just wanted to be chosen sometimes, to be checked on without having to break first, to be held without earning it through resilience, but I was the daughter who never asked. And because I never asked, they assumed I never needed. This is where my story begins, not with a scream, not with a fight, but with a quiet understanding that settled into my bones. High school wasn't much different from home, except that at least there were people outside the walls who didn't already know my story. I learned quickly that being unnoticed at home had a strange benefit. I could practice being invisible anywhere. Teachers didn't call on me unless necessary. Classmates barely noticed me, and honestly, that suited me just fine. I watched my sibling blossom, loud, charming, effortless, and I envied them with a quiet, knowing intensity that no one ever saw. They were praised for every little achievement, first in a test. Applause, first place in a competition, celebration, every misstep of mine, an opportunity for criticism disguised as advice. It wasn't fair, I knew it wasn't fair, and yet I learned to smile. Because smiling was easier than arguing, because arguing never changed anything, because arguing only reminded me that my family didn't care enough to listen. By the time I graduated, I had built myself a kind of armor. I could endure silence, neglect, and subtle cruelty without breaking down, but the armor came at a cost. I had learned not to expect love. I chose a college far from home, partly to escape, partly to see if the world beyond my family could see me differently, and at first it did. Friends admired me for my reliability. Professors praised my dedication. I made people feel safe because I had spent a lifetime learning how to make others feel safe while hiding my own fear and longing. But even as I succeeded, a quiet ache lingered at the edge of every victory. No one noticed the nights I cried myself to sleep, the evenings I forced down dinner because the thought of yet another argument at home made my stomach twist. The mornings I woke up exhausted even after a full night's sleep because my brain replayed old hurts. When I returned home during breaks, the pattern repeated. At 21, I came back with a scholarship, glowing with pride and carrying every ounce of excitement a young woman could have after accomplishing something she'd worked so hard for. I expected my parents to look at me and see it, the blood, sweat, and tears that had gone into this. Instead, my mother nodded politely and asked about my siblings' weekend plans. My father said, "Good, good, you'll do well wherever you go." They didn't ask what I had sacrificed. They didn't ask how I felt. They didn't celebrate with me because, in truth, they were busy celebrating the easy victories, the ones that didn't make anyone uncomfortable. I realized something important that day. My family didn't see me as a person, only as a means, a helper, a buffer, a silent witness. And so I learned another truth. Love in my family was transactional. It was given only when it was convenient, only when it served a purpose. I became hyper-aware of my place, the daughter who should be grateful for what little attention she received, the one who should endure quietly, smile politely, and never complain. I swallowed this reality. I stuffed it down deep. I smiled when they smiled, nodded when they nodded, and pretended to be fine because I had learned early on that my voice didn't matter. By my late 20s, I had built a life that others could admire, but no one at home could fully appreciate. I was successful, independent, thoughtful, yet invisible. I was always the strong one, the calm one, the one who could be counted on, but the one whose needs were always last. I learned to stop asking for help because asking meant inconvenience. I learned to stop expecting empathy because empathy was a luxury I was never afforded. I learned to stop hoping for validation because validation had never been mine to claim. And still, somewhere in the quiet corners of my heart, I ached for something simple: recognition, a word of praise, a hug for no reason, a glance that said, "I see you." It never came. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I replay moments of childhood, small moments, almost invisible to anyone else, that carried more weight than anyone could imagine. Like the time I stayed up all night to finish a school project, hoping my parents would notice my effort. They didn't. Like the time I cried silently in my room after my sibling was praised for something I had done better. They didn't ask why I was crying. They didn't even notice. And each time the ache settled a little deeper in my chest. It was around this time I began to understand something else. My pain was not meant to be acknowledged. My family didn't notice because they were too caught up in their own stories. And I learned that if I wanted to be seen, I had two options: beg for it, which felt humiliating and hopeless, or create my own space. Away from them, I chose the latter. It was not revenge yet. It was survival, it was quietly deciding. One day I would be enough even if they never realized it. And that, Rebecca, that quiet decision would eventually grow into something more profound. Something that could not be ignored. By the time I turned 30, I had a life that many would call enviable. I had a career I loved, or at least, a career that allowed me to feel competent and in control. I had friends who genuinely cared, and a quiet apartment that felt like the only place in the world where I could exhale without apology. But every time I returned home, the old weight returned. Family gatherings were particularly brutal, not because anyone was overtly cruel, but because they didn't see me. I sat at the dinner table, recounting my week, sharing small victories, offering stories I thought might interest them. My words fell flat, polite nods, quick changes of subject. Smiles that didn't reach their eyes, and then, as if rehearsed, the attention would shift, instantly, exclusively, to my sibling they had won again. Not through talent or effort necessarily, but simply by being the person my family chose to elevate. I remember one evening vividly. I had just completed a major project at work, one that had required months of research, late nights, and personal sacrifice. I returned home, carrying the pride like a fragile glass sculpture. "Rebecca, that's wonderful," my mother said, eyes flicking up briefly. Then she turned toward my sibling. "How's your new hobby going? The project, the effort, the late nights, invisible." I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I simply nodded, smiled politely, and excused myself to the kitchen to make a cup of tea. I realized then that it wasn't just about recognition. It was about the fundamental truth: my family would always prioritize others over me. The anger started small, a flicker, a quiet burn behind my ribs that I carried silently for years. I couldn't voice it, not safely, not without being labeled dramatic or ungrateful, so I held it in. I tucked it away behind a careful smile. I buried it under charm and courtesy, under accomplishments and helpfulness, until it became part of the armor I wore everywhere. And yet, it wasn't gone. It was a shadow, quietly stretching, reminding me of every time I had been invisible, every time I had been overlooked. Every time I had been expected to sacrifice my own heart for the comfort of others. Around this time, I began noticing something I had never admitted to myself. I was tired of surviving for everyone else's peace. I was tired of being the invisible glue that held everyone together. I wanted no, I needed to be seen. I started small. I began expressing opinions at family events, tiny things, preferences about meals, stories, anything that had always been assumed. The reactions were immediate, not positive, not understanding. "You're being difficult," my father said, half joking, half annoyed. "Don't make it about you," my mother warned softly, as if my existence had become a threat simply by speaking. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plead for recognition. I just noticed, fully, the truth I had been avoiding all my life. I didn't need their permission to exist. The first whisper of what I would later call revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't about shouting or punishing anyone. It was quiet, subtle, internal. I decided that if they wouldn't notice me, I would notice myself. If they wouldn't celebrate my victories, I would celebrate them. If they refused to give me attention, I would give myself the attention I deserved. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, my life began to change. I spent evenings reading books that inspired me. I pursued projects that excited me, not because they would impress anyone, but because they made me feel alive. I nurtured friendships that were reciprocal, not one-sided. The more I invested in myself, the more I realized how long I had spent living for approval I would never receive. One evening, after a particularly draining family dinner, I sat alone in my apartment. I poured myself a glass of wine, sank into the couch, and allowed myself to feel something I hadn't felt in years: relief. I was finally done performing for them. And as the quiet warmth of that realization spread through me, I understood something profound. My revenge would not come from confrontation. It would come from living a life so full, so complete that they could no longer dismiss me. It was not vindictive, it was not cruel, it was self-preservation. And for the first time in decades, I felt the tiniest flicker of something I had almost forgotten: hope. Rebecca, at 33, is standing on the precipice of change. The girl who never asked for love has grown into a woman who knows her own worth. The daughter who was always overlooked is learning how to make herself impossible to ignore. The quiet pain of the past has not vanished, it still lingers, but it no longer dictates every choice I make. I am beginning to see clearly that the greatest revenge is not retribution. It is recognizing your own value when no one else does, and that, I realize, is only the beginning. It never fails. No matter how far I travel, no matter how much I achieve, family gatherings always pull me back into the same roles I've known since childhood. I arrive, smile, hug, exchange pleasantries, and then watch silently as the attention moves elsewhere. At 33, I have learned to anticipate the pattern. But knowing doesn't make it easier. The last dinner at my parents' house started like every other. The table was set immaculately, my mother humming softly as she moved dishes around. My father sat at the head of the table, reading the newspaper, pretending not to notice my arrival. My sibling was already there, animatedly describing their day to my parents, who nodded and laughed with exaggerated delight. I cleared my throat. "I had a really productive week at work," I said, forcing lightness into my voice. "We completed a project ahead of schedule and my team was really happy with the results." Polite nods. A faint, distracted smile, and then silence. My words had landed like feathers on a stone floor. And before I could even swallow the lump forming in my throat, my sibling piped up with something trivial but loud, a story about their new hobby, about their social media post, about some small recognition at work. And suddenly the table erupted. Laughter, attention, energy. I sat there, invisible, and realized once again that my accomplishments were irrelevant. My presence was relevant only when convenient. I had learned to bite back the words I wanted to say. I'm right here, I have a life, I have feelings, I exist. I swallowed that urge and sipped my water instead. It's not that my family didn't love me, or at least they didn't intend cruelty. They simply never noticed me. Or worse, they noticed, and it was easier to dismiss my achievements than to change the story they had written about me. The girl who was always strong was always expected to endure quietly. After dinner, as dishes were cleared and my sibling chatted loudly about weekend plans, I went into the kitchen to help. I heard my mother whispering to my father, "She's so quiet tonight. Don't you think she's distant?" Distant, not hurt, not frustrated, not accomplished. Distant, I almost laughed. It was the same word they had always used to describe me: quiet, reserved, patient. A polite way of saying, "Rebecca, we do not care enough to see you." Later that evening, alone in my room, I allowed myself to breathe. I turned over the day in my mind, noting every slight, every dismissal, every invisible moment, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: anger, not a loud, explosive anger. No screaming or throwing things, a slow, simmering fire that traced the contours of my chest. I realized something crucial: they didn't respect me. Not because I was mean or rude, not because I had done anything to deserve their indifference, but because I had always let it slide. I had accepted invisibility as my role. And by accepting it, I had allowed it to continue. The days that followed were strangely liberating. I began noticing the little things: how my siblings still sought approval for every minor accomplishment, how my parents only reacted to emotions that were loud, messy, or inconvenient, how often my own successes went unnoticed unless I somehow made them impossible to ignore. I realized I could no longer settle for this, not with my parents, not with my sibling, not with myself. It started subtly. I stopped minimizing my presence. I spoke when I wanted to, not when it was convenient for everyone else. I expressed opinions without hesitation. I didn't ask for permission. The reactions were immediate. "Rebecca, you're being difficult," my father muttered under his breath at a Sunday lunch. "Don't make it about you," my mother said quietly, shaking her head. For the first time in decades, I didn't shrink. I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't looking for revenge yet, not really. I was simply staking my claim. That claim, however small, carried consequences. My siblings' laughter faltered when I voiced my opinion. My parents exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. For the first time, I wasn't the safe one, the calm one, the quiet anchor. I was visible, and it unsettled them. And I realized then, visibility could be a kind of power. I spent the night alone in my apartment, reflecting on the pattern of my life. I had spent years molding myself into someone acceptable, palatable, convenient. I had perfected silence and invisibility. I had absorbed everyone else's pain while hiding my own. But now, for the first time, I understood something profound. I did not need to continue living like this. I didn't have to ask for love. I didn't have to beg for recognition. I didn't have to shrink into the background while the people who were supposed to see me refused to. The quietest, most devastating kind of revenge was beginning to take root. And it didn't require confrontation. It required truth, boundaries, and the courage to finally be seen. I had always sensed it, the quiet, unspoken hierarchy in my family. But until my early 30s, I had tried to convince myself that it was my imagination. Maybe my sibling just needed more attention. Maybe my parents were just busy. But as the years added up, the truth became impossible to ignore. They had favorites, and it was not subtle, not kind, not accidental. It started with a phone call I received one evening while sitting in my apartment, sipping a mug of tea. "Rebecca," my mother said casually, "we need you to help with something for your sibling. They're struggling with an investment project and we thought you could advise." I blinked. "I am happy to help," I said carefully. "Good," she said, already distracted, "come by tomorrow morning. And don't tell anyone else, we want it to be a surprise." I hung up, my chest tightening. It wasn't the request itself I could help. I had the experience, the knowledge, the patience. It was the way it was phrased. I was the family's invisible resource, their secret problem solver, their fixer. But my siblings' achievements were celebrated, mine were merely expected. The next day I drove to my parents' house, carrying a folder of notes and spreadsheets. My sibling was there, smiling as if the world revolved entirely around them. "Thanks for helping," they said casually. "I didn't want Mom and Dad to fuss if I got it wrong." Fuss, that was the word, fuss. They didn't want fuss for me, my mistakes were ignored. My successes were ignored, my pain was ignored, and yet for them, every minor struggle was a matter of attention, of concern, of careful guidance. I felt something settle in my chest, cold and heavy. This is favoritism, I realized. They never hid it, and I had spent years pretending it didn't exist. I left that day not angry, not shouting, just quiet, but inside a plan began to form. A subtle, careful response that would not require confrontation. Because by now I understood the family too well, direct confrontation would be dismissed, minimized, or turned into a lesson about how difficult I was. No, I would rise quietly. I would not compete, I would not fight, I would simply be undeniable. The revelation of favoritism unlocked another painful truth: my parents had always rewritten history. I began remembering small moments from childhood. The time I stayed up late to prepare a school presentation, only to have my parents comment on how tidy my sibling's project was. The time I cried silently over a minor heartbreak, and no one asked me what was wrong, while my sibling received comfort for a broken fingernail. The time I was sick, miserable, exhausted, and my parents sent me to school anyway, insisting I was strong, while calling my sibling's mild cold a major problem. It all made sense now. The favoritism had been constant, deliberate, and devastating. I felt grief rise first, a quiet, unbearable grief for the little girl who had learned to be invisible. Grief for the years of labor, love, and care that had been ignored. Grief for a family that had never truly seen me. Then anger followed, sharper and steadier than I expected. Not the explosive kind of anger, not something that would make a scene. No, this was cold, measured, and dangerous in its clarity. I would no longer be overlooked. Over the next few weeks, I began making changes. Small, deliberate ones. I stopped volunteering for invisible tasks. I stopped explaining myself to anyone who wouldn't listen. I stopped softening my words so they wouldn't be too much, and quietly I began documenting everything. Achievements, accolades, moments where I had given and sacrificed without recognition. Not as a weapon, not yet, but as a mirror. A mirror I could one day hold up to them, silently, powerfully. The strangest part, they didn't notice, not at first. My absence from the invisible roles I had always filled went unremarked. My calm acceptance of favoritism continued, but now it was deliberate. I wasn't submissive anymore. I wasn't their quiet resource. I was Rebecca, fully unapologetically, and that scared them more than any argument ever could. That night, alone in my apartment, I allowed myself a strange, dangerous feeling, hope for vindication without cruelty. I realized that revenge did not have to be loud or dramatic. It could be subtle, living fully without asking for permission, being celebrated outside the house while they remained blind, becoming a presence that could not be ignored. For the first time, I understood that my life could be my own kind of justice. People always called me strong. It was a label I wore like a badge. Teachers, friends, family, everyone seemed to believe I had infinite reserves of patience, courage, and resilience. And in many ways I had, but strength is not imperviousness. Strength is not absence of pain. Strength is sometimes the ability to carry your broken pieces quietly, in private, so no one notices until they finally begin to weigh you down. It started subtly. Small tremors I could ignore at first, sleepless nights after a long day of holding everyone else together. a lingering ache in my chest that didn't have a cause. Moments of panic when the phone rang, wondering if someone needed something from me again. I told myself these were temporary, manageable. I had handled worse, but the small tremors became cracks. One afternoon, after yet another family dinner where my efforts, my presence, and my achievements had gone unnoticed, I went home and collapsed on the couch. For hours, I didn't move. I didn't cry, at least not at first. I just sat there, letting the silence press against me, the quiet weight of decades of being unseen. Eventually, the tears came, not loud, not dramatic. Just small, relentless streams that ran down my cheeks while I stared at nothing. I realized something terrifying. I had been holding my pain in for so long that I didn't even know how to release it properly. My mental exhaustion was complete. I felt like a dam that had held back a river for decades. Every slight, every dismissal, every favor given to someone else while I faded into the background had accumulated into a flood. And now it was spilling over. The irony was bitter. Everyone had always called me strong. No one had ever seen the quiet breaking that came from carrying so much. No one had ever asked if I was tired. I was tired, exhausted, worn out, and aching for even a single person to notice that the woman they called strong was human. At first, I tried to ignore it. I forced myself to sleep, to eat, to go to work, to maintain appearances. I smiled, I laughed, I responded to texts. I even helped a friend move that weekend, but inside something was eroding. It was not anger, not yet, it was grief. Grief for a life that had been spent proving worth to people who would never see it. Grief for a self that had been hidden so long that I sometimes forgot it existed. One evening, I sat with a journal I had kept sporadically over the years. I opened it, pages filled with careful observations, tiny triumphs, and endless apologies for existing too loudly. I read through entries where I had documented every time I had helped, every time I had sacrificed, every time I had swallowed my own needs to make someone else comfortable. The grief hit harder than anything before, and then slowly, almost imperceptibly, I felt a spark of something else. Anger, not explosive, not vengeful. Just a cold, steady fire that burned at the edges of my exhaustion. I realized that my life had been quietly stolen by expectation that I would always be strong. Expectation that I would always put everyone else first. Expectation that I would always endure. I didn't have to endure anymore. Over the next few days, I began taking small steps toward reclaiming myself. I allowed myself to rest without guilt. I said no to responsibilities that weren't mine. I gave myself permission to cry without shame. I began acknowledging my own achievements without waiting for anyone else to validate them. It was not dramatic, it was not immediate, but it was real. For the first time in decades, I felt a sense of ownership over my own life. I also began noticing the subtle ways my family reacted. My mother's polite nods carried hesitation, as if unsure how to handle the new Rebecca. My father's casual instructions were met with quiet refusal. My siblings' charm faltered slightly when I no longer positioned myself as the silent supporter. I didn't point it out, I didn't comment, I simply existed fully, visibly, and unapologetically. And that, I realized, was the beginning of my quiet revenge. That week, I allowed myself a thought I had suppressed for years: strong women don't cry. But when they break quietly, they can rebuild stronger than anyone imagined. I had broken, but I had also begun to rebuild, not for them, not for their recognition, for me. And the realization carried a quiet satisfaction I had never felt before. They had underestimated me for decades, and that mistake would follow them forever. I stopped volunteering, not loudly. Not with fanfare, not in protest, I simply stopped. I didn't attend the family events I didn't want to attend. I didn't pick up calls I didn't feel like answering. I didn't offer advice on matters that weren't mine to solve. I didn't make excuses. I didn't apologize, I just existed elsewhere. And for the first time in decades, I felt a strange, fragile freedom. It wasn't easy. The guilt crept in first, silent, insidious, a whisper that said, "You're selfish, you're abandoning them, you're failing." I recognized it immediately. Old patterns, decades in the making, demanding obedience and invisibility. I resisted. I reminded myself, I am not responsible for their comfort. I am responsible for my life. And slowly, deliberately, I began to walk away. The first real test came at a Sunday dinner. I arrived late, something I had never done before. My mother's eyebrows lifted, my father glanced up from his paper, and my sibling paused mid-sentence. "Rebecca, you're late," my mother said softly, with a tension that made her voice brittle. "I know," I replied calm. "I had things to finish." I didn't apologize, I didn't explain, I didn't over-explain, I simply sat and ate. The air felt different that night, not hostile, not overtly cold. Just unfamiliar. I was no longer the obedient, available, invisible one. I was someone who had chosen herself first. In the following weeks, I maintained the distance quietly. I stopped calling just to check in. I declined last-minute requests. I politely but firmly said no to anything that required my emotional labor for their convenience. At first, they didn't notice. Then slowly, subtle ripples of tension appeared. My siblings stopped relying on me for help they had always assumed would be there. My parents stopped giving me instructions and advice. They didn't know how to address a Rebecca who no longer needed their approval to exist. I didn't rub it in. I didn't make a scene. I simply walked away without explanation. It was liberating. For the first time, I realized the quiet power of absence. They had spent decades expecting me to hold everything together. And now, without confrontation, without anger, without protest, I was choosing not to hold it for them anymore. They didn't understand it yet. They probably never would, but I did. The first time I noticed real change was during a casual weekend visit. My sibling, usually lively and animated, seemed uncertain. My mother looked uncomfortable, pausing mid-sentence. My father's polite nods carried hesitation. No one said it aloud. No one made a scene. They were noticing me, or rather, noticing my absence from the role I had always played. And I felt a quiet satisfaction, deeper than any confrontation or argument could have given me. Walking away without a scene was not about revenge in the traditional sense. It was about agency. It was about reclaiming control of my time, my energy, and my emotional well-being. It was about saying to the world, quietly but unmistakably, I am not invisible. I am not obligated to endure your neglect. I am choosing myself. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to notice something amazing. Freedom does not demand loud validation. It only demands courage, the courage to put oneself first. That courage, Rebecca, became my new identity. I stopped fearing what they would think. I stopped anticipating criticism. I stopped shrinking. I was no longer the daughter who silently endured. I was a woman who had learned the power of quiet absence, and it terrified them more than any outburst ever could. By the end of this chapter, I had begun to live entirely on my terms, free from the invisible chains of familial expectation. The seeds of my quiet revenge had taken root, not through confrontation, but through independence, not through argument, but through visibility and absence, not through anger. But through living a life they could not ignore, and for the first time in decades, I felt a strength that wasn't borrowed, conditioned, or expected. It was mine. It was almost imperceptible at first, a phone call not returned immediately, a small problem unresolved because I didn't step in, a text left unanswered for a day. At first they didn't notice, or at least they didn't react, but slowly I began seeing the ripples of absence in the family I had always been expected to uphold. The first moment of clarity came one Saturday afternoon. My father called, not urgent, not angry, but curious. Rebecca, we need your help with something, he said. I hesitated. I had a busy day, but for decades I would have rearranged everything to accommodate them. I'm a little tied up right now, I said softly, the words deliberate. Maybe later. There was a pause. Later, he repeated, uncertain. Yes, I said, and I hung up. It was the first time I had ever said no without guilt, without apology, without justification. The next day I went about my routine, coffee in the morning, work on projects I cared about, a long walk in the evening. And yet, in the back of my mind, I felt a shift. When my mother called that evening, her tone was different, careful, hesitant. Rebecca, I thought you could help with something, she said softly. I'm sorry, I replied. I can't this week. Another pause, and then silence. It hit me then, they missed me, not for who I was, not because they suddenly cared. They missed what I had always done for them. I realized it was a strange kind of power, one I had never had before. For decades, I had been the invisible fixer, the quiet presence holding the household together, the emotional buffer for everyone's convenience. And now, when I stopped being all of those things, the absence was noticeable. It wasn't dramatic. There were no arguments, no shouting matches, no scenes, just a quiet, uncomfortable tension that I could feel whenever I interacted with them. My sibling no longer assumed I would solve their problems. My parents hesitated before giving instructions. Small inconveniences, once easily ignored, now became visible in their eyes. And I smiled quietly to myself. This was the revenge I had been seeking, subtle, invisible to everyone else, but utterly satisfying to me. I was no longer the default caretaker. I was no longer obligated to absorb their struggles. I was no longer a shadow moving silently behind the brighter lights of their world. For the first time, I could watch them navigate life without me, and it was enlightening. The effect extended beyond mere inconvenience. At a family dinner, I arrived and casually let my sibling take the lead. Normally, I would have mediated, guided, fixed every tiny tension. This time, I sat quietly, sipping my drink, observing. And they struggled, not in danger, not in disaster, just discomfort, moments of confusion, subtle frustration. My sibling's smile faltered. My parents glanced at one another. I said nothing. I didn't intervene, I simply existed, and that was enough. For me, the quiet revelation was profound. I didn't need confrontation to reclaim my power. I didn't need anger or vindictiveness. I didn't need their recognition. All I needed was my absence. They noticed me only when I stopped saving them. That realization carried a strange satisfaction, a warmth I had not felt in years. I had spent decades being invisible. I had carried their emotional burdens silently. I had hidden my pain, ignored my own needs, and survived quietly. And now I could exist fully unapologetically while they realized what they had taken for granted. It wasn't cruelty, not revenge in the ordinary sense. It was subtle, it was quiet. It was emotional mastery. I had discovered that my life could be my own form of justice, thriving without their acknowledgement, rising without their applause, existing without their control. By the end of this chapter, I was no longer just surviving. I was consciously living. I was reclaiming my presence. And I was witnessing the quiet, unspoken disorientation of a family that had always assumed I would be there to fix everything. For the first time, I felt the satisfaction of being irreplaceable on my own terms. It had taken me years to reach this moment, not years of planning, not years of plotting revenge. Just years of silent observation, of absorbing the subtle dynamics, of learning who I was and what I deserved. And now, finally, I was ready to speak. It began quietly at one of those family dinners I had once dreaded. Everyone was talking over one another. My sibling was describing their latest achievement, the one I had heard about countless times already, while my parents nodded and praised. I cleared my throat. "Can I say something?" I asked softly. The conversation faltered. My sibling looked at me with curiosity. My parents raised eyebrows, surprised by my sudden interruption. "Yes," my father said slowly, almost cautiously. I took a breath. "I've been quiet for a long time," I began, "and I've let a lot go unnoticed. I've tolerated being invisible, being the default helper, the silent observer, because I thought that's what was expected of me. I thought that was how I had to exist to be loved." They nodded politely, not yet understanding the gravity of what I was saying. "I've realized something," I continued, my voice steady, calm. "I've realized that this family has favorites. Some of us are celebrated for every minor thing. Some of us are expected to carry everything quietly and be thankful when anyone notices us at all." I let that settle, let the silence fill the space. My mother's hands twitched in her lap. My father's jaw tightened. My sibling's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I didn't rush, I didn't shout, I just stated the facts. "I have given everything I could for this family," I said. "My successes, my help, my patience, my time, often invisible, often ignored, often minimized, and I can no longer accept that as normal. I will not be invisible anymore." It was strange how quickly the power shifted, not because I was loud, not because I was angry, not because I demanded apology, because I was calm, clear, truthful. Truth has a weight that anger cannot match. It's steady, unyielding, uncomfortable, and suddenly they were uncomfortable. My sibling tried to interrupt, a nervous laugh masking discomfort. "Rebecca, you're being dramatic," they said. I shook my head almost sadly. "No," I said gently, "this isn't drama, it's observation, it's fact. And I am not exaggerating." My mother's eyes watered slightly, though she quickly blinked it away. My father looked down at his hands, silent. I continued. "For years, I've been the one who absorbs tension, who smooths over conflicts, who sacrifices without notice. And in return, I received polite nods, silent acknowledgement. Occasional praise that felt more obligatory than genuine, and I let it happen because I didn't know any better, because I thought that's what being loved required." The room was still. I could see the truth settling in, the reality they had avoided for decades. I was not accusing, I was not pleading, I was merely holding up a mirror, and mirrors can be brutal. "I am not angry," I said finally, "but I am no longer willing to be unseen. I am no longer willing to be quiet while others are elevated at my expense. I am no longer willing to sacrifice my presence for the comfort of those who cannot or will not see me." That is the truth, and it is mine. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, uncomfortable. My sibling looked down, twisting a napkin nervously. My mother's mouth trembled as if she wanted to speak but could not find words. My father's fingers drummed silently on the table, a quiet rhythm of unease. And I realized something profound: truth spoken calmly without malice is more devastating than any argument or fight. It leaves no escape, no misunderstanding, no room for denial. I didn't expect apologies, I didn't need them. The shift had already occurred, the imbalance had already been exposed. I had done what I came to do, I had spoken my truth. Walking away from the table that night, I felt lighter than I had in decades. No, it hadn't erased the pain. No, it hadn't fixed everything. But it had done something far more powerful. It had made me visible on my own terms. It had forced them to confront what they had ignored for too long. It had given me my voice back. And for the first time in my life, I felt untouchable by their dismissal. I never needed to prove anything to them, not really. Yet, after years of being overlooked, ignored, and minimized, there was a strange satisfaction in seeing them notice without me ever having to point it out. The difference was subtle. I did confront, I didn't yell, I didn't demand apologies. I lived, I threw myself into life in ways I had never allowed before. I pursued projects that excited me, not just those that seemed practical or expected. I traveled to places I had dreamed of but never visited. I invested in friendships that were reciprocal, nurturing, and joyful, and for the first time, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known since childhood. It wasn't about proving that I was better than my sibling. It wasn't about showing my parents that they had been wrong. It was about proving to myself, and only to myself, that my life belonged to me, and yet the side effect was powerful. My family began to notice, though they wouldn't admit it. My siblings' usual confidence faltered slightly when they realized I was no longer a convenient support. My mother's questions became hesitant, careful, uncertain. My father's attempts at guidance were met with calm, deliberate independence. They didn't understand what had changed, and that secretly delighted me. I watched them navigate life without me at the center, and it was enlightening. For the first time, they experienced the subtle inconvenience of my absence from the roles I had always filled. No yelling, no confrontation, just living without me as the invisible caretaker. It was revenge, quiet, gentle, and utterly satisfying. I also began noticing changes in myself. I laughed more easily. I slept more deeply. I spoke my mind without fear of judgment. I allowed myself joy without guilt. This wasn't about making them suffer. This wasn't about punishment. It was about freedom. And freedom, as I discovered, is the sweetest form of revenge of all. There were moments that made me smile quietly to myself. My siblings struggling to plan an event I would have once organized flawlessly. My parents hesitating before asking me for advice that they had taken for granted. Casual conversations where I realized I no longer had to absorb every tension, every burden. I said nothing. I intervened only when I chose to. I gave nothing that I did not want to give. And that in itself was revolutionary. It doesn't need confrontation, it doesn't need shouting, it doesn't need humiliation. Thriving quietly, being full, whole, and unapologetic. Living a life so undeniable that absence becomes a lesson, not words. I allowed myself to celebrate quietly my accomplishments at work, my personal growth. The peace I felt in my own skin for the first time in decades. And with every achievement, every moment of joy, every instance of self-recognition, I felt a quiet thrill. This is what you overlooked. This is what you minimized. This is what you will never control. By the end of this chapter, Rebecca had fully embraced life as her own form of revenge, finding joy, independence, and self-worth without needing to lash out. Her family, meanwhile, was forced to witness the impact of their favoritism and neglect, subtly, without confrontation, without drama, simply through her thriving life. It always happens like clockwork, not before, not during, but eventually when I no longer carry their burdens silently, when I no longer exist as the invisible lifeline of the household they call. The first call came one Wednesday evening. "Rebecca," my mother's voice trembled softly over the phone. "We missed you at the dinner yesterday." It wasn't the same. I paused, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and caution. "I see," I replied calmly. "It sounds like you realized my absence." There was silence on the other end. A small, awkward pause that said more than words could. "Yes," she said finally. "We didn't mean to overlook you, I interrupted gently. "Mom, you did overlook me for years. And it's okay, I've accepted it, but I've also learned not to let it define me." I didn't yell, I didn't plead, I didn't demand apologies, I simply spoke truth. And there it was, the uncomfortable, heavy silence of recognition. Over the next few weeks, the calls became more frequent. My father called about a minor repair he assumed I would handle. My sibling asked for advice on a project, not realizing I had already set boundaries. My mother invited me to an event, carefully phrased, almost begging for participation. And every time I realized something profound, they were only noticing what they had lost by overlooking me for so long. One evening, I sat with a cup of tea and reflected. They wanted me back. They wanted my help, they wanted my presence, my calm, my strength. They wanted me to be invisible again, but I had changed. I was no longer the girl who swallowed pain silently. I was no longer the daughter who put everyone else first without recognition. I was not theirs to command. When my sibling nervously asked for advice one evening, I answered. But this time I did not overextend. I gave guidance only where it was appropriate. I allowed them to struggle where it was safe. I did not rescue every mistake. It was subtle, it was quiet. But the impact was profound. They realized slowly, painfully, that my presence could not be assumed. When my parents expressed regret, I listened. I acknowledged their feelings without diminishing my own. I appreciate you saying that, I said gently, but words are not enough. I've learned that my peace, my boundaries, and my life are my responsibility. If you want a relationship with me, it must respect that. It was not punishment, it was not revenge, it was clarity. And for the first time, I felt a balance I had never known, love without self-erasure. There were moments of discomfort, of hesitation, of awkward attempts at reconnecting. My mother sometimes overcompensated with attention, forgetting boundaries. My father tried to regain control subtly, only to be met with calm resistance. My sibling oscillated between envy and admiration, unsure how to relate to a Rebecca who was no longer available on demand. And yet I remained steady. I did not rush forgiveness. I did not demand change. I simply stood in my truth, unshaken, unapologetic, and fully visible. The realization struck me quietly, like the slow glow of sunrise. I did not need them to recognize my worth for me to know it. I did not need their approval to validate my achievements. I did not need their favoritism to define my happiness. They could miss me, they could regret their oversight, but that did not alter the fact that I had finally claimed my life. It took decades. Decades of silence, decades of patience, decades of invisibility, and yet here I was. Sitting at the small cafe I loved, sipping my coffee, letting the morning sunlight warm my face, I felt something I had rarely allowed myself to feel: complete presence. Not just for myself, but for the world. I had survived neglect, favoritism, and the subtle erasure of my existence. I had carried invisible burdens that no one had noticed, and I had emerged whole. The first step toward this moment had been realizing that their neglect did not define me. The second step had been stepping away, walking away quietly, deliberately, without anger. The third step had been speaking my truth, calmly, clearly, without malice. And the fourth step had been thriving, living my life unapologetically, letting absence itself speak volumes. It was only then that they truly began to see me, not just the achievements, not just the independence. Not just the calm strength I had always carried, but me, the person behind the silence, the person behind the sacrifices, the person behind decades of quiet endurance. The phone calls came. The invitations became intentional. I realize I've never properly thanked you for all you've done, my mother said one afternoon, her voice soft, hesitant, almost trembling. It's taken me far too long to notice, but I see you now. My father added quietly, we've always relied on you, and we didn't understand how much that hurt you. I'm sorry, I nodded calmly without rushing to forgive, because seeing me now did not erase the past, but it acknowledged the truth I had carried alone for so long. Even my sibling, who had been the favorite for so many years, finally admitted something quietly over dinner. I never realized how much I depended on you, they said softly, almost ashamed. You were always there and I took it for granted. I smiled gently. I hope you've learned that everyone has limits and no one should be invisible for the sake of someone else's comfort. It wasn't harsh, it wasn't cruel, it was honest. I realized then that being seen was not about drama. It was not about revenge. It was about truth, resilience, and self-worth. I had achieved the rarest kind of justice, recognition without begging. Respect without anger, closure without malice. I felt tears welling up, but they were not the tears of sadness I had known for decades. These were tears of relief, tears of validation. Tears of a life reclaimed, I was finally seen, not because I demanded it, not because I performed for it, but because I had chosen myself. And in that quiet, luminous moment, I understood the ultimate lesson. The greatest revenge is a life fully lived, a heart fully healed, and a soul unapologetically free. They had underestimated me for years, they had overlooked me for decades, and yet in the end I had emerged whole.